Welcome to the Big Book Study podcast for anyone and everyone interested in a spiritual way of life. We are a step study which meets each week on Sundays at 2 p.m. Eastern and Wednesdays at 9 p.m. Eastern. You can find our website at primarypurposeBigBookStudy.com. This podcast series is a brief study of each tradition as presented in the original 12 Steps and 12 Traditions. AA has made the difference between misery and sobriety, and often the difference between life and death. Therefore, the AA Society of men and women in the beginning realized the urgent need for continuous effectiveness and permanent unity, and saw that we must work together and hang together, else most of us will finally die alone. The 12 traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous are what beginning AAs believed the best answers that their experience had given to those ever urgent questions. How can AA best function? And how can AA best stay whole and so survive? I am Jacqueline from Washington. We also have Kathleen from Colorado, Tina from Idaho, Kashi from Florida, and Lisa from Michigan. Today's study is on Tradition 2, and I'll kick off our reading here. Tradition 2 reads, "For our group purpose, there is but one ultimate authority, a loving God as he may express himself in our group conscience. Our leaders are but trusted servants, they do not govern." Where does AA get its direction? Who runs it? This too is a puzzler for every friend and newcomer. When told that our society has no president having authority to govern it, no treasurer who can compel the payment of any dues, no board of directors who can cast an erring member into outer darkness, when indeed no AA can give another a directive and enforce obedience, our friends gasp and explain, this simply can't be. There must be an angle somewhere. These practical folk then read Tradition 2 and learn that the sole authority in AA is a loving God as he may express himself in the group conscience. They dubiously ask an experienced AA member if this really works. The member, sane to all appearances, immediately answers, "Yes, it definitely does." The friends mutter that this looks vague, nebulous, pretty naive to them. Then they commence to watch us with speculative eyes, pick up a fragment of AA history, and soon have the solid facts. What are these facts of AA life which brought us to this apparently impractical principle? John Doe, a good AA, moves, let us say, to Middletown, USA. Alone now, he reflects that he may not be able to stay sober or even alive unless he passes on to other alcoholics what was so freely given to him. He feels a spiritual and ethical compulsion because hundreds may be suffering within reach of his help. Then, too, he misses his home group. He needs other alcoholics as much as they need him. He visits preachers, doctors, editors, policemen, and bartenders, with the result that Middletown now has a group, and he is the founder. So again, my name is Jacqueline from Washington State, and just a few reflections on the beginning here of Tradition 2. So in the beginning, it's basically outlining the perplexity that many folks might feel initially in coming into the 12-step program, that there's not this hierarchical organization of the group, and that, again, we're relying on a loving God as he may express himself in our group conscience. And in the 12 steps, we're defining our higher power or that God to each individual. But as a group, we're all tapping into that same source and listening and allowing that to guide the group as we share, as we're inspired. Not many groups are organized like this, and so there's a real novelty factor for many of us coming into program. The other thing that's keeping this permeable is that unless we're giving this to another, so as it says, unless he passes on to other alcoholics what was so freely given to him, he may not be able to stay sober. So there's this permeable relationship where we're given this sobriety, we're given this new spiritual way of life, but only so long as we continue practicing and continue giving. So while we might create these groups and tap into parts of society, as it says, preachers, doctors, editors, men, and bartenders, we're only so good as we're giving back to others. And with that, I'll pass for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Jacqueline. That's Kathleen here in Colorado. So it's a very different way of doing things, of organizing this tradition. And for us that are addicts, we found this new way of living, and it's by the instructions in the 12 steps. And we are now relying on a higher power as our director of our lives. This is very radical for a lot of people. A lot of people apparently don't have to do that, but addicts and codependents, we have a spiritual malady. So we don't have the power to overcome our thinking and our cravings and our obsessions. And so we have to turn to something and build a relationship with this higher power that helps us. And tradition 2 is the same way. It's just how it's relating to how our groups are run, how our group conscience is run, and how our organization is run. So we rely on a higher power to be the authority rather than any one person. And that higher power comes through each member of the organization in each moment of whatever's going on. And so this is the way that tradition 2 is basically just saying, ultimately, there is only one authority, and it is a loving God, and meaning that it's a benevolent, loving God. It's not a God that's trying to tell everybody what to do or control, or it's not the same as what we're used to maybe leading our own lives or leading organizations. And yeah, it's just very foreign to people when they see it. And it's not the way that they live their life, but we have to live our life this way. We have to live our personal life this way, and we have to live our group life this way, or we won't survive. Thanks.
Thanks, Kathleen. Hi, it's Lisa from Michigan. In this reading, I think we hear why the AA groups exist, why the fellowships and the meetings exist, because someone with this spiritual malady needed to give it away or lose it. And so once we've had this awakening ourselves and have worked the 12 steps, we want to share this with others who are suffering needlessly. So we want to, and we feel compelled to carry this message, which is the steps that lead us to the spiritual solution. So the establishment of any individual group should be motivated by this spiritual experience. Thus, we establish groups to bring that experience to others. So God is really what's behind the group in the first place. We can be founders of specific groups and that we are humans who started it, but we couldn't do so without God, who's the true founder. Yes.
Thanks, Lisa. This is Nicole. When looking at this paragraph, I was thinking about that they arrived at that idea because of the experience of what it is to be an addict that we all share, whether we're reaching for alcohol or we have a behavioral addiction, is that we've tried to use human power to solve our problems and it didn't work. We tried managing our lives by governing and controlling and punishing and exerting power over things and people and correcting and criticizing and judging, defending, comparing, and it didn't work. Being convinced that it fails us entirely, but we're going to try those things. We're not cured of our addiction, but we keep reaching for this new way of life. And eventually those behaviors, this new way of living starts to become more of a working part of the mind. I was thinking about page 52 of the big book of AA, where it says, lack of power, that was our dilemma. We had to find a power by which we could live, and it had to be a power greater than ourselves. So a higher power directing each of our individual thoughts that we bring to our group conscience, our business meetings, and then taking the action of expression. So it's not just that we're connecting with our higher power, but we're also taking action, giving voice, thought, contributing, offering what comes. And then each of the individual expressions makes up the collective expression. And they talked about the idea of unanimity, that it's the collective consciousness that we're reaching for, the consensus of the higher power of the group. I'll pass.
Hi, this is Tina in Idaho. And the first thing that I see in this section is actually in the tradition itself. For our group purpose, there is but one ultimate authority, a loving God, as he may express himself in our group conscience. Our leaders are but trusted servants, they do not govern. And then in that first paragraph, it says again, these practical folk then read tradition 2 and learn that the sole authority in AA is a loving God. What our meeting expresses here is love. That's what we're always asking ourselves. Is it loving? Loving is not necessarily pleasing, but it is having this idea of being helpful, having this idea of being useful, and having this idea of checking in that may express himself, checking in with our inner resource, our higher power, our inner guide, and listening for guidance about what's next and what would be loving. The last section here, John Doe, a good AA, moves, let's say, to Middletown, USA. Alone, he reflects that he may not be able to stay sober or even alive unless he passes on to other alcoholics what was so freely given to him. So when we find this precious gift of recovery, we realize that it has to be the center of our lives. We have to do our 2 jobs, stay close to our higher power, perform his work well. And it's not just a idea of doing that. It's our life depends upon us doing that. So we all get to then move past our self-absorption, past our self-doubt, past our self-loathing to try to help and try to practice. And with that, I'll pass.
This is Kashi in Florida, and I'll keep reading. Being the founder, he is at first the boss. Who else could be? Very soon, though, his assumed authority to run everything begins to be shared with the first alcoholics he has helped. At this moment, the benign dictator becomes the chairman of a committee composed of his friends. These are the growing group's hierarchy of service, self-appointed, of course, because there is no other way. In a matter of months, AA booms in Middletown. The founder and his friends channel spirituality to newcomers, hire halls, make hospital arrangements, and entreat their wives to brew gallons of coffee. Being on the human side, the founder and his friends may bask a little in glory. They say to one another, perhaps it would be a good idea if we continue to keep a firm hand on AA in this town. After all, we are experienced. Besides, look at all the good we've done, and these drunks. Besides, look at all the good we've done. These drunks. They should be grateful. True, founders and their friends are sometimes wiser and more humble than this, but more often at this stage, they are not. Growing pains now beset the group. Panhandlers panhandle, lonely hearts pine, problems descend like an avalanche. Still more important, murmurs are heard in the body politic, which swell into a loud cry. Do these old-timers think they can run this group forever? Let's have an election. The founder and his friends are hurt and depressed. They rush from crisis to crisis and from member to member, pleading. But it's no use. The revolution is on. The group conscience is about to take over. Pass.
Thanks, Kashi. Hi, it's Lisa from Michigan. Yeah, some thoughts here. Very dramatic setup here that we hear a lot of drama. And usually when there's a lot of drama, we're in our disease. And so we can see like these old timers get very comfortable with their meeting, and they do consider their meeting, right? So we see the defects coming up, which we're all susceptible to if we have this spiritual malady. It doesn't matter if we're alcoholic, codependent, overeaters, gamblers, whatever we are, we have this pride and these old ideas that tell us we know what's best. Nobody else can do this right. I'm just going to take over. It'll be easier, my way or the highway. And all of this kind of thinking leads us into a rut, and it leads to what ends up bubbling up is that things aren't running smoothly anymore. And so we see, though, what happens is actually a good thing, is that the other members start to realize that they need to get involved, in that this is where that group conscience comes in, that they need to take a part and take a stand and take a role in this fellowship, in this meeting. And that's what ultimately is very important to keep the groups flourishing, is that everyone is involved. We're not there just to listen or to get something, right? That's our old way, would be to go to a meeting to get liked, to get loved, to compare and compete, tell war stories. But the founders and how they established the meetings were to help others. And so we get back to that, back to the basics of the purpose of the meeting. And then we realize that purpose can be met when everyone participates and becomes a living and breathing part of the meeting. With that, I'll pass.
Thanks, Lisa. This is Nicole. I was reading that Bill Wilson said that nobody invented Alcoholics Anonymous, that it grew. Trial and error has produced rich experience. So as the part of this reading that stood out to me was growing pains, and how the step work is described as being a spiritual transformation. They're giving this example of someone who recovered, they wanted to pass on how they recovered. They proactively searched for people that they could help, and a group was formed, and there was work to be done, and they just assumed those roles because there was no other way to go about it. They were the only ones there to do it. And then as the group began to grow, then there was this shift from service to authority, and that imbalance was felt. We can feel when we're off that spiritual center, and then a transformative process starts to take place. And it's describing chaos and instability and shifting and cracking, but also in the midst of all of that chaos, there's a spiritual center that begins to form. And a higher power, a group conscience, is taking over and forming in the place of authority and power. So even stuff that looks like it's not good or bad things are happening, that there is a higher power in all of it. And ultimately, the things that aren't needed or aren't working will fall away. If we want this thing bad enough, then they'll fall away and something new will take its place if we keep working towards it. I'll pass.
Thanks, Nicole. This is Kashi in Florida. And so in the first paragraph that was read, this is a depiction of what it's like when someone practices their 12th step to try and carry this message. And this is also a good depiction of the early stages of meeting development. In the second paragraph read, this is a good illustration of the lack of humility that comes with feeling like a big shot and people being high on thinking they're in charge. And then lastly, in the third paragraph read, the human condition of wanting to be in control and display territorialism opens up like a can of worms. Newcomers want and have a right to claim their seats as well and participate as much as anyone else. Pass.
Thanks, Kashi. Kathleen here in Colorado. What this makes me think of is how a higher power, if a higher power is in charge, then we don't, that's anything could happen, right? And from our small perspective, if we, in this case, the founders of this group, if they have a different idea, but there are many others that have other ideas, and the group conscience is what makes the decision, then that is higher power's agenda. We learn in this program that we are not in charge anymore. Life happens as it is with everybody participating. And this program is not here to create some sort of dependency. The only dependency that we have as individuals and as a group is a dependency on a higher power. So we don't look to humans for our solutions anymore, things and humans outside of ourselves. We look to a higher power. And even if we have established groups, as the founders have done here, that doesn't mean that we are in charge of the groups or that we want people to, or the group to depend on us for things and for everything. So that dependency is not, even though we have the instructions or we might have more experience practicing this 12 steps, or we might know the instructions a little bit better, or we might know what the purpose of the groups is a little bit better because we've been around. It still doesn't mean that we want to create any kind of dependency. What we want is it talks about in the big book how glorious it is for us to watch people that we work with flourish and their lives become these ever expanding, wonderful things that they are leading through their program of recovery, this new life. And it's the same for groups, for our organization. We get to watch it become what it's becoming. And it will be perfectly higher power's will as it unfolds and not our will. Thanks.
Thanks, Kathleen. This is Tina in Idaho. And let's see, it says, who else could be the boss? And he was it. And fortunately had a very inspired idea that needed to start an actual meeting, a group. And it says at this moment, the benign dictator, and I looked up benign dictator, and it says the person who has to run things, but does it with a good motive. And it has to be self-appointed. There's no one to appoint him. Then in that next paragraph, let's see, there's natural conflicts that come up. We don't even know how to be a person when we start this recovery. We don't even know how to be us, let alone how to be part of a group. And our higher power has such great plans for us that our higher power wants us to not only live individually, but to also, of course, be part of loving groups. So I just see higher power's design in all of this, wanting us to have these full, meaningful, connected lives, and how these groups are our first way of learning how to have healthy connection. So in the growing pains paragraph, now beset the group, panhandlers panhandle, lonely hearts pine, problems descend like an avalanche. So all of these things described are very much really codependency. And they didn't understand codependency at a time. They set the stage for us to be able to recover from all of our maladies. And so in some sense, because of them, we have a leg up on this whole learning how to function as a group, because we are learning that there are many ways in which we are sick. One way in which we are sick is this codependency way that can really inform our progress. So when it says in this next section, let's have an election, what we learn is that now we know where we can find higher power. We can find higher power in our group conscience. And we do our group conscience decisions. I think it's the last Sunday of every month. And we know and trust that's where we're going to hear the will of higher power, a loving higher power for our group. Just like we know what tools we need to exercise to hear the will of higher power for us personally. And with that, I'll pass.
This is Nicole. Go ahead and continue reading where we left off. So now comes the election. If the founder and his friends have served well, they may, to their surprise, be reinstated for a time. If, however, they have heavily resisted the rising tide of democracy, they may be summarily beached. In either case, the group now has a rotating committee, very sharply limited in its authority. In no sense whatever can its members govern or direct the group. They are servants. Theirs is sometimes thankless privilege of doing the group's chores. Headed by the chairman, they look after public relations and arrange meetings. Their treasurer, strictly accountable, takes money from the hat that is passed, banks it, pays the rent and other bills, and makes regular report at business meetings. The secretary sees that literature is on the table, looks after the phone answering service, answers the mails, and sends out notices of meetings. Such are the simple services that enable the group to function. The committee gives no spiritual advice, judges no one's conduct, issues no orders. Every one of them may be promptly eliminated at the next election if they try this. And so they make the belated discovery that they are really servants, not senators. These are universal experiences. Thus, throughout AA does the group conscience decree the terms upon which its leader shall serve. And I'll pass.
This is Kashi in Florida. So where it says reinstated for a time, sometimes newcomers want to continue gaining their bearings and keep watching and learning and keep focusing on their recovery if it's in early stages. And then the belated discovery, they are servants. And so like in a corporation, there may be a pyramid with leaders at the top. And so in this fellowship, it's upside down. They are describing the pyramid being upside down, like all who volunteer and serve, it's all for the group. It's all for the newcomers. So it's all to pass on what's been so freely given. Pass.
Thanks, Kashi. Hi, it's Lisa from Michigan. We hear in this paragraph this description of this idea of rotation of service, and that it's not about authority in our groups, but about being of service and where we can be most helpful and useful without running the show. And from this, we have our group conscience meetings where there are elections as needed for any service roles. And we learned that we can participate in those meetings as well to be helpful and useful. And so, we see this shift of it becoming about service. And with that, I'll pass.
Kathleen, you're still on mute.
Thank you, Kathleen, here in Colorado. I'm seeing here, in no sense whatever can its members govern or direct the group. They are servants. Much like when we sponsor people, we are not directing and governing them. We are servants to carry the message. That's our role. And the group's role is to carry the message to those who still suffer. And so we are not, when we are in roles in this group, we are not, or in any group, roles such as treasurer or facilitating the meeting or secretary, we don't govern or direct the group. We are servants, and often it's thankless. It can be quite a bit of work, but we consider it a privilege, just like we consider it a privilege to work with others as when we're sponsoring and helping them learn the steps. And helping them to find their new ideals based on their higher powers direction. We're looking here at how can we serve, how can we be of service in a helpful and useful way, directed by our higher power. And being of service is different than directing and governing and having all the ideas about what the group should do and shouldn't do. We are here to help and to hold these different tasks that we take on, and we agree and we do it thankfully. Thanks.
Hi, this is Tina in Idaho. And when I read this, I really think, wow, how amazing it is, and how much I see higher power in how they did all of this. We knew when we started our meeting that we were going to have a rotating committee. How did we know that? Because they went through all of this. We had the benefit of all of their hard fought blood, sweat, and tears history that we could read about in the 12 and 12, that we could learn about. And yeah, so we knew we were going to have a rotating committee, rotating leaders. And then this idea that they are servants. So what we learn when we are servants, like when we do anything, when we sponsor, when we lead the meeting, when we are a treasurer, that it's a seeking higher power. It's an inside out thing. It's not an ego based thing. And with that, I'll pass.
Thanks, Tina. This is Nicole. I was looking up how they defined where it says the group conscience decree the terms upon which its leaders shall serve. So I was looking up how they came to a definition that they shared about what a group conscience is, and like what the purpose of it is, or what we're aiming for, what we're setting our navigation towards as we're trying to practice this thing. And it said it's a place where rotating service positions are elected, that reports are received, like the treasurer report, group matters are discussed and acted upon. And from the spiritual perspective, what they were trying to aim for was that everyone comes together and has all of the information, so that information is shared freely to come to a spiritual and deeply considered consensus free of debate. And they spoke about the idea of hearing individual points of view, and it was intended to make room for even the shyest member of the group to speak. And then they would have a point where if there was a vote and there was a minority that didn't elect to whatever decision was made, there was a minority that didn't agree with the decision, they were given time to speak. And that the principle of that wasn't so much about someone in the minority having an opportunity to voice their opinion again, but giving everyone in the group an opportunity to listen with an open mind and heart, to put aside any dominant opinions that we might have or fixed opinions, and listen willingly and fully and consider those views. And they said some groups elected that they didn't really go by a yes or no decision, that if a vote was very close, that they thought about how that might divide the group, even though the vote might be 6-5. And so they might say, okay, we'll go this direction because this yes vote won. They thought about that tabling the decision, because they said this might be something that could divide the group. There's a very clear split in how this is being, how each individual higher power is seeing this. And it didn't mean that they had to all agree, but they were looking for substantial agreement, to that they were unifying, broad, roomy, and all-inclusive. And I'll pass.
Thanks, Nicole. This is Jacqueline. Going back to the end of our last section, that last sentence, the group conscience is about to take over. As was discussed, there are kind of these ripples that have started emerging with selfish, self-serving, dishonest, fearful, inconsiderate behaviors, because it's a group of humans, and that's come up. And as the group conscience, as God or their individual definitions of God are speaking through them, these kind of undulations, these ripples in the water start taking form. And in this paragraph that we're looking at here, these waters are finding a way of becoming humbled again, of becoming of service, of reuniting with the group conscience. That word at the last sentence, decree, is often used in legal terms as something that's quite binding, like a legal binding, but it can also be used as a foreordained will, God's will. And so I feel like that difference, the multitudes that word decree can actually hold, is quite apt there, in that we're not talking about some governing body of humans and their respective egos, but quite the contrary, where AA, it says thus throughout, AA does the group conscience decree the terms upon which its leaders shall serve. So it really is God's will. It is this group consciousness, that humility that's leveled out the ripples in the water, and the waters become smooth again as the group becomes realigned with the group conscience. And with that, I'll pass. Thanks.
And this is Tina in Idaho. If nobody has any other comments, I'll keep reading. So this brings us straight to the question, does AA have a real leadership? Most emphatically, the answer is yes, notwithstanding the apparent lack of it. Let's turn again to the deposed founder and his friends. What becomes of them? As their grief and anxiety wear away, a subtle change begins. Ultimately, they divide into two classes known in AA slang as elder statesmen and bleeding deacons. The elder statesman is the one who sees the wisdom of the group's decision, who holds no resentment over his reduced status, whose judgment, fortified by considerable experience, is sound, and who is willing to sit quietly on the sidelines, patiently awaiting developments. The bleeding deacon is one who is just as surely convinced that the group cannot get along without him, who constantly connives for re-election to office, and who continues to be consumed with self-pity. A few hemorrhage so badly that, drained of all AA spirit and principle, they get drunk. At times, the AA landscape seems to be littered with bleeding forms. Nearly every old-timer in our society has gone through this process in some degree. Happily, most of them survive and live to become elder statesmen. They become the real and permanent leadership of AA. Theirs is the quiet opinion, the sure knowledge, and humble example that resolve a crisis. When sorely perplexed, the group inevitably turns to them for advice. They become the voice of the group conscience. In fact, these are the true voice of Alcoholics Anonymous. They do not drive by mandate, they lead by example. This is the experience which has led us to the conclusion that our group conscience, well advised by its elders, will be, in the long run, wiser than any single leader. And I'll pass for now.
This is Kathleen in Colorado. Wow, what a beautiful reading that points to what true leadership looks like, and the humility and the quiet opinion, leading by example. So it's not I am the leader. It's speaking from one's own experience and from one's relationship with this higher power. It's such a great thing to aspire to. One of the things I love about these traditions is we can use them everywhere in our life, not just here in our groups, but to really, and then the collectiveness of the wiser elder who's been around for a while. It's not just one, it can be many that have been with the group for a long time and can, by example and in their quiet, humble way, help lead through crisis and continue to give voice at group conscience. And then it also talks about the flip side, what it looks like to have a leader that is in their ego. And basically, it's about being the leader and about everyone seeing them as the leader. It's so caught up in so many of the things that lead us to drink, that lead us to act out. And it references that here, that if we sit there and do that, if we stay on that bandwagon, we're going to crash and burn and possibly cause the group to crash as well. I just love being able to, I'm super excited to be studying these traditions in this way on this podcast. I think it's taking such a deep dive for me personally to get more, just to learn more about what has already been done. These are elders to me. The ones that wrote this book are our elders. Thanks.
Thanks, Kathleen. This is Kashi in Florida. And so this portion about the bleeding deacon and elder statesman, to me, this illustrates how the promises work in the program. When we endure growing pains, we continue to get served slices of the humble pie. We continue to stay in the program. We continue to practice our own recovery. And we grow in understanding and effectiveness by staying and practicing and serving. And through that, we end up elder statesmen. Thanks. Pass.
Thanks, Kashi. This is Nicole. Yeah, I think that what this brought to mind is just the traditions themselves and even the description of the traditions that they brought to the 12 and 12. They didn't say this is how groups have to be run. They didn't try to enforce what it was supposed to look like or what groups were supposed to do or not do. They just offered their experience. They went through trial and error and then offered what their experience was in the hope that it might help others. But they didn't say, you have to do it this way. They just offered what they found to be helpful and what their own experience was, and they passed it on to us. And I'll pass.
Thanks, Nicole. This is Jacqueline. One thing that I find interesting about this section talks about a few hemorrhage so badly that drained of all AA spirit and principle, they get drunk. At times, the AA landscape seems to be littered with bleeding forms. And then this sentence in particular is intriguing to me. Nearly every old timer in our society has gone through this process in some degree. Happily, most of them survive and live to become elder statesmen. So to me, that just highlights that we're all traveling our own recovery journeys, and that encompasses imperfection and fine-tuning and realigning with higher power on that daily basis. But that doesn't mean that ego, selfishness, self-serving behaviors can eke in, and the greater wisdom that comes through in the group conscience is also reflected as individuals as we learn to grow. It's differentiating between the elder statesman who has this kind of quietude, is able to sit back and watch and patiently observing, patiently awaiting developments, as it says. And yet, to get to that point, they may have gone through that bleeding deacon state as well. And again, to me, this points why there is no one individual. There are not a set of individuals that are necessarily leading the group, that we all are stepping in service in time and as we're inspired to carry the group, but that what's leading it, and again, leading back to tradition too, it really is this group conscience. We are all being guided by this group conscience of the collective higher power. With that, I'll pass. Thank you.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Hi, it's Lisa in Michigan. Just a couple comments. Yeah, this idea of leading by example, we find that this is going to work in our groups, not only in our groups, but we can also take this idea into our relationships, that we get what we give and what we bring. So if we bring what we want to see, humility, patience, gentleness, and a bit of joy and fun, that's what we're going to get back. With that, I'll pass.
Thank you, Lisa. This is Tina in Idaho. And so the 12 steps guide our individual lives in recovery. And these traditions guide our group's life, so to speak. And we learn not by thinking our way there. We learn by positive, constructive action. And higher power shows up. And if we make mistakes in our individual lives, we get lots of chances to course correct. And it's the same thing in our groups. We get lots of chances to course correct. So if ever we make a decision that time reveals, when we took a group conscience and we make a decision and time reveals that it probably wasn't a great decision, at the next business meeting, another motion can be made. So this is an evolving process. Our lives continue to grow. We grow in understanding and effectiveness individually, and we grow in understanding and effectiveness as a group and as individuals within that group. And this isn't about popularity contests. We're fortunate in that when I read about this election stuff, I'm really glad that what we get to have is trusted servants, people who volunteer. We don't have elections. We have people who step up to chair our meeting. There are guidelines about what experience they need in order to be able to fill that position. But the true servant is that we are volunteering our time to be helpful and useful. We don't have elections in our meeting, and it's not about popularity contests, and really elections could lead to that. So I think it's just such a wonderful thing that it's evolved in our meetings to, and I don't really know of any meetings, frankly. I bet there are. I bet there are meetings where they have elections, but it's just so wonderful that in our meeting we get to be strictly volunteers, trusted servants. And with that, I'll pass.
Okay, Kathleen here. I'm going to keep reading. When AA was only 3 years old, an event occurred demonstrating this principle. One of the first members of AA, entirely contrary to his own desires, was obliged to conform to group opinion. Here is the story in his words. One day I was doing a 12-step job at a hospital in New York. The proprietor, Charlie, summoned me to his office. Bill, he said, I think it's a shame that you are financially so hard up. All around, these drunks are getting and making money, but you're giving this work full time and you're broke. It isn't fair. Charlie fished in his desk and came up with an old financial statement. Handing it to me, he continued, this shows the kind of money the hospital used to make back in the 1920s, thousands of dollars a month. It should be doing just as well now, and it would, if only you'd help me. So why don't you move your work in here? I'll give you an office, a decent drawing account, and a very healthy slice of the profits. 3 years ago, when my head doctor, Silkworth, began to tell me of the idea of helping drunks by spirituality, I thought it was a crackpot stuff. But I've changed my mind. Someday, this bunch of ex-drunks of yours will fill Madison Square Garden, and don't see why you should starve meanwhile. What I propose is perfectly ethical. You can become a lay therapist and more successful than anybody in the business. I was bowled over. There were a few twinges of conscience until I saw how really ethical Charlie's proposal was. There was nothing wrong, whatever, with becoming a lay therapist. I thought of Lois coming home exhausted from the department store each day, only to cook supper for a house full of drunks who weren't paying board. I thought of the large sum of money still owing my Wall Street creditors. I thought of a few of my alcoholic friends who were making as much money as ever. Why shouldn't I do as well as they? Although I asked Charlie for a little time to consider it, my own mind was about made up. Racing back to Brooklyn on the subway, I had a seeming flash of divine guidance. It was only a single sentence, but most convincing. In fact, it came right out of the Bible. A voice kept saying to me, quote, "The laborer is worthy of his hire," end quote. Arriving home, I found Lois cooking as usual, while three drunks looked hungrily on from the kitchen door. I drew her aside and told the glorious news. She looked interested, but not as excited as I thought she should be. And I'll pass.
Hi, it's Lisa from Michigan. Yeah, in the story from Bill here, we see how we can be when we're in our heads, how we can talk ourselves into anything. And we start to case build and we become convinced that this human solution is going to solve all our problems. This is just going to be the most perfect thing in the world. And that's really shows us why we need the fellowship and why we need each other, because left to our own devices, we can rationalize anything and even come up with backup support for ourselves. But we see right away, even when he mentions it to his wife Lois, that there's some hesitation there. And again, it just shows that we need other viewpoints sometimes to hear God's voice. We can easily become confused about what is and is not divine providence. And so that's the beauty of this whole tradition, and understanding that the ultimate authority of God is going to speak through others, is going to speak through the group. And that's how, we're ultimately going to see what God's will is. And with that, I'll pass.
Thanks, Lisa. This is Kashi in Florida. And so in the beginning of the reading, it refers to 12-step job. And that's when we carry the message to those who are still sick and suffering. We show up to practice and try and carry the message of what's been passed on to us, what's been so freely given to us, we freely give to others. And so that's why Charlie's proposal is not in alignment with this tradition, because we can never charge people for step work. We can never charge people to help them when they reach their hand out for help in wanting to get sober or wanting to have a spiritual way of life, whatever the addiction is. And there are a lot of people who work in treatment centers and rehabs as addiction counselors and specialists and addiction advocates, but this is not the same as one addict working with another. And so that was the telltale sign of his wife's lack of enthusiasm. It didn't match what Bill had hoped she would respond with. And I will pass with that. Thanks.
Hi. Go ahead if you had a comment.
Yeah, Kathleen here. It struck me a little bit. This is a learning process that's happening right here. This is the story where we don't know the end of the story yet, but we're learning, we're going to watch these traditions forming in action. And it struck me that this person, whatever his name was, Charlie, that he even knew that Bill was so broke. And I know that in our recovery, it promises that we will straighten out spiritually, physically, financially, relationally. I don't think that's a word that's used, and in my own recovery, if I'm running around complaining or letting other people know, whether it's my financial situation or my relationship status or whatever, if other people know about that, then I'm likely not using my recovery tools in some way. It's just interesting to me that Charlie would even know that Bill was broke. So that must be known somehow or talked about. And this is what life brings to us on a regular basis. I call it hooks. There's so many things out in the world that will tempt us and try to hook us and bring us back into our old way of thinking and our old way of life, which was relying on things on the outside to make us feel better on the inside. And this whole program of recovery, what saves us from our disease, which is horrific, is relying on our higher power for everything. And so it's like we're learning to be able to see how that happens, have awareness about how these things come into our world to try to get us to do it the old way. And maybe there's a new way, and we're about to see how that's going to unfold in according to these traditions. And it also, if someone is making a lot of money at it, if we go back to the tradition that we're working on, which is about the only authority is a loving God, if Bill is paid for everything that he's doing, then it's naturally going to begin to set up a hierarchy. And that's the very thing that we're learning about right now in this story. And with that, I pass.
Thanks, Kathleen. This is Jacqueline. Yeah, as has been alluded to, we don't quite know the conclusion of this story yet in our reading, but just some foreshadowing in the way that it's described. I was bowled over. There were a few tinges of conscience until I saw how really ethical Charlie's proposal was. So again, we don't know yet in our reading what's coming of this, but there's a dissonance there that's being highlighted where something just didn't quite sit right. And then, in fact, it came right out of so I had a seeming flash of divine guidance. It was only a single sentence, but most convincing. In fact, it came right out of the Bible. A voice kept saying to me, "The laborer is worthy of his hire." That's an interesting quote to pick out of the Bible, particularly when it's referring to a laborer, because when we're showing up in service to others, it's not labor. And so there's just some little jarring moments in the way that this is described that there's a little bit of dissonance there. And I'll pass with that. Thank you.
Okay, I'll continue reading. This is Lisa. It was meeting night. Although none of the alcoholics we boarded seemed to get sober, some others had. With their wives, they crowded into our downstairs parlor. At once, I burst into the story of my opportunity. Never shall I forget their impassive faces and the steady gaze they focused upon me. With waning enthusiasm, my tale trailed off to the end. There was a long silence. Almost timidly, one of my friends began to speak. "We know how hard up you are, Bill. It bothers us a lot. We've often wondered what we might do about it. But I think I speak for everyone here when I say that what you now propose bothers us an awful lot more." The speaker's voice grew more confident. "Don't you realize," he went on, "that you can never become a professional? As generous as Charlie had been to us, don't you see that we can't tie this thing up with this hospital or any other? You tell us that Charlie's proposal is ethical. Sure, it's ethical, but what we've got won't run on ethics only. It has to be better. Sure, Charlie's idea is good, but good isn't good enough. This is a matter of life and death, Bill, and nothing but the very best will do." Challengingly, my friends looked at me as their spokesman continued. "Bill, haven't you often said right here in this meeting that sometimes the good is the enemy of the best? This is a plain case of it. You can't do this thing to us." So spoke the group conscience. The group was right and I was wrong. The voice on the subway was not the voice of God. Here was the true voice, welling up out of my friends. I listened, and thank God, I obeyed. Yeah, a couple comments here. This idea of, sometimes the good is the enemy of the best. Bill was known for making this statement that only the best was going to do for this fellowship. And this is brought out. And this is why we let God be the authority, because God knows what's best. He's a higher power. He sees the whole picture where we see only our own little piece. And Bill was able to hear this through his fellow and realize that he had been wrong. The voice wasn't the voice of God. And so many times we might think that we're being divinely inspired and we're really not. It's really our head talking. And if we stay in communication with our fellows and we do this thing called the group conscience, this is where there's a chance for God's voice to be heard. And then finally, this idea that I obeyed. And so many people think it's old fashioned, but we do, when we're in this program and we've recovered, we have decided that we're going to obey this higher power because our way hasn't worked. Our way brought us to our knees. Our way brought us to our bottom. And so there is the best way. And that best way is going to be listening to God. And this tradition points out that we hear that in group conscience. And with that, I'll pass.
Thanks, Lisa. This is Nicole. I was drawn to this part where it says, almost timidly, one of my friends began to speak. And it makes me think about how when we approach belonging prior to working the steps and trying to live this new way of life, belonging to a group might look like we want to get invited. We're looking to get something in order to join in, looking to make sure that we're liked or we're approved of. And so there's this new way of belonging that's focused in giving. We belong because we say we belong. We belong because we join in, we offer, we contribute. And sometimes that means walking through a lot of discomfort to speak up and share what our higher power is directing us to share. And then the other part that I was drawn to was, sure, it's ethical, but what we've got won't run on ethics alone. It has to be better. And then this is a matter of life or death. I don't know the reasoning behind why they came to their decision, but thinking about the good of all and making decisions one way is like right or wrong and moral principles. It might look like the right decision, but that the decision has to be bigger than us. And thinking about in every decision that we make, returning and circling back around to our primary purpose, to help the alcoholic or the person who's still suffering. And more than half of the alcoholics that came to Alcoholics Anonymous were atheist or agnostic. That could set things up for a lot of suspicion around the idea of a higher power. And if there was something to be gained or some kind of monetary or other benefit to sharing these steps and how they work the steps and how they recovered, it might get in the way of somebody coming to this with an open mind. So anything that might get in the way of being here for the person who's still suffering. And I'll pass there.
Thanks, Nicole. This is Kathleen in Colorado. So I'm seeing this. Don't you realize that you can never become a professional? As generous as Charlie has been to us, don't you see that we can't tie this thing up with his hospital or any other? I think what I'm hearing behind that, how I interpret that is that we can't tie this thing up with you, and we can't tie this thing up with a hospital, and we can't tie it up with somebody that owns a hospital, and we can't tie it up with anything else. What we're tied up with is our higher power. We're tied up with this authority that comes out of a group conscience that is directed by higher power. And that's the only thing we can get tied up with. If we get tied up with Charlie or the hospital or with you as a professional, now you become the authority, or possibly could become the authority, or Charlie becomes the authority, or the hospital or some other organization becomes the authority. And the way that he's talking about it getting tied up in this situation is by money. So if he gives us money, we're going to get tied up. And I'm hearing this is the moment where it got realized, oh, here's a really blatant example of we have to protect where we're tied up. We have to protect it. And we're the only ones that can protect it. And the way that we protect it is through this group conscience. And the way that this group conscience is saying is that we are independent of all human solutions. and we are dependent on the one solution, which is a higher power. Thanks.
Thanks, Kathleen. So in this section, we're reminded that they were meeting in each other's homes. And in this particular excerpt, they were in Bill Wilson's home. He also had alcoholics who were living there, who were boarded. And when I researched it, they weren't getting any money for that. It was part of their 12-step work. And then when it says, so don't you realize, he went on, that you can never become a professional. So what we learn and what our other traditions say is 12-step work is forever non-professional. So we always take people through the steps for fun and for free. It saves our life. It is, in fact, its own reward. And then on the last page here, it says, Bill, haven't you often said right here in this meeting that sometimes the good is the enemy of the best? This is a plain case of it. You can't do this. So that only of their lives, we're wound up, we're tied up in keeping this thing for fun and for free. And when I did some more looking into it, I heard a guy say that if we do things 1 through 5, sometimes 2 through 5, things 2 through 5 might be sucking my energy from number 1. And that is an example of this statement that the good, we have to stay focused on this thing that's saving our lives. And it's so wonderful, that statement. Here was the true voice welling up out of my friends. So what we learn in this recovery that we do is we learn to be honest with each other. We learn to walk through our discomfort and to let our higher power guide us instead of letting our fear around belonging or irritating someone or whatever. We are guided by higher power, and we just show up and we contribute. And then this last, as he may express himself in our group conscience. So that just takes us back to, if it is not loving, it isn't God. But this whole section tells us that love isn't wimpy. Love shows up, and it's informed by all of the step work that we've done, all of our experience. So that's why we talk about experience, strength, and hope. So we are informed by everything that's gone on before in our individual recovery and everything that's gone on before in our collective recovery in our groups. And with that, I'll pass.
Thank you, Tina. Oh, go ahead, Kashi. If you have a comment, please go ahead. I was going to read the long form, Kashi. So if you have a comment, we'd love to hear it.
Okay, so this is a powerful way that they ended this chapter when Bill realizes that he thought that he had the voice of God flowing through him when his intellect pulled out this verse from the Bible, and when he was on the train. And the big book talks about how we can mistake this conscious contact with God as when we're learning it, for all kinds of absurd ideas, that it's something that takes practice in cultivating. And so he realizes the difference from his intellect to on the train to when his friends collectively speaking the truth was the group conscience. And I'll pass with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Kashi, and thank you everyone for your shares today. I'd just like to read the long form of tradition 2 that closes out this chapter. For our group purpose, there is but one ultimate authority, a loving God as he may express himself in our group conscience. And with that, I can go ahead and close up today's podcast reading. So thank you for joining us today. Our next podcast will be for the month of March. We'll be covering Tradition 3. You can find our meetings at Primary Purpose bigbookstudy.com. We meet each week on Sundays at 2 p.m. Eastern and Wednesdays at 9 p.m. Eastern. Join us on the road of happy destiny. Thank you.